Good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. This is Mike Petrilli, the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here with Mike McShane at the American Enterprise Institute, and of course, the Fern. Yes, altogether we are a Fern between two mics. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to see the Fern. You're keeping it watered and well taken care of.
You know, this is great. We have latched onto these webcasts. You know, we don't have a live audience here.
Yeah.
We do have to feed the Fern, but that is much cheaper than feeding Washington interns.
Exactly.
Which is what we would be doing if we actually had a live event right now.
Yeah,
so we like that.
For sure.
So for those of you that don't get this hilarious joke about a Fern between two mics, let us say where this comes from. There's a webcast, right?
Yes.
That called...
Zach Galifianakis does what? Between Two Ferns.
Between Two Ferns.
And the last time we had one of these conversations, someone on Twitter, I think, said, oh, it's actually, instead of between two ferns, it's a fern between two mics.
Yeah.
And, you know, we just took that and ran with it.
We're going with it.
We just took it and
absolutely.
ran with it.
That other webcast is supposed to be really funny and awkward and hilarious. And we'll see if we do it. Yeah, awkward. We can do awkward. We can do that.
do awkward.
Yeah. And it had President Obama on it at one point.
Right?
So we can aspire to that.
I think we can.
All right, well, excellent. Well, so Mike and I are going to do these things from time to time. This is our second one. Our first one was about the Common Core.
Yep.
And in that one, I mean, clearly we have solved all problems with the Common Core. There's a nationwide consensus
really
now
smooth sailing from here.
that issue's in the bag. Okay, so that's not an issue anymore. All right, this time we're going to take up Vergara and the Vergara copycat suits. These, of course, are the lawsuits having to do with teacher tenure, with LIFO, and related issues. Now, those of you out there in internet land, you are a critical part of this. We want you to be a part of this conversation on Twitter. The hashtag is Fern2Mics. I think we are showing that on the screen right now. Fern, the word two, and mics. And please, if you've got questions, comments, but especially questions, tweet to that hashtag, and I will be following along on the handy iPhone.
Outstanding. Trying
to pay attention to that conversation. We'll try to incorporate those comments and questions in there. At least if people are, not the hate mail. I've been getting a lot of hate mail lately.
You get so much Twitter hate. It's like every time I do one of these things, like I have a very small little Twitter account that maybe people retweet things, but it'll be like tagged with you in there, and there is so much Twitter hate.
They mostly hate me over the Common Core. Now they can hate me over teacher tenure.
I've never seen a bigger disparity between like personality and Twitter hate. Like the nicest guy in the world, so much Twitter hate. Lots of terrible people out there, no Twitter hate. I don't know. There's something wrong with this world.
That's probably the dance videos. All right. Enough with the preliminaries, let's get started. Okay, so the original Vergara case out in California really had to do with three different issues, right? There were the LIFO laws. These are the last in, first out laws that in a few states like California basically mandated, said to districts, if you have to do layoffs, you have got to do it based on seniority and seniority alone, right? So that was one piece. Second piece was around getting tenure, teacher tenure, which are these sort of extra due process rights that senior teachers can get in public education. And in California, they said after 2 years, you're eligible for tenure, and that became part of the issue. And then finally, this question around dismissals. Once you have tenure, what does it take to actually dismiss a teacher if he or she is not doing a good job or does something crazy in the classroom? What is that process like? Can you actually move that teacher out? So tell us, in that original Vergara case, what were some of the arguments that were heard on both sides, and what did the court decide?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think the argument was the sort of foundation for all of this is that good teaching is a necessary condition of a sound public education. As is guaranteed by the California Constitution and state constitutions all across the country. So to have access to a quality education means to have access to quality teachers. And the argument was that these types of policies prevent students, particularly low-income and minority students, from having access to high-quality teachers. So for example, LIFO policies will, if you have a quality blind layoff, it would, as the judge ruled, said, it would privilege the older, ineffective teacher over the younger, more effective teacher.
And in California, they had to prove that this was having a disparate impact on poor and minority students.
Yes, and the judge, borrowing from the legal world, held it up to the standard of strict scrutiny, which is an extremely high standard that these policies have to be basically like the least restrictive way in which states could possibly accomplish these goals.
All right, so on LIFO, he determined that did, in fact, violate the rights of students. What about the tenure decision?
Yeah, tenure, he ruled in a sort of similar fashion that actually, even though it says that it's 2 years, by the time teachers actually have to be notified, I think it was sometime in like March of their second year, so it condenses it down even farther. And so it has that sort of same thing. It is not an effective screen to keep ineffective educators out of the classroom. And again, with dismissal, it was the same thing. It was not an adequate process to exit ineffective teachers from the classroom.
It took too long, it cost too much money, et cetera. Okay. Joe, let's show up on the screen that we've got a map. Oh, we don't have the map. Oh, okay, so never mind. But you can see on
I wasn't sure if there was about to be like
this was going to be so awesome.
How do you respond to this?
This was going to be super slick. But if you'd like to go to our Flypaper blog, you can find a blog post about this. And there's a nice map we borrowed from the National Council on Teacher Quality. It shows how long does it take until you're eligible for tenure in the various states. And my colleague Brandon Wright made the argument, and I think he's right, that California had a very extreme position in saying only after just 2 years you could become a tenured teacher. That is unusual. That is definitely on the low side and much lower than something like 40 of the states.
Yeah, I think in the ruling itself, and on that map, I think what's in Mississippi is only 1 year, which is wild. But then it said, 5 states, it takes 2 years or less, 32 states, it's 3 years, and 9 states are 4 or 5 years.
And then he also argued that California, in the other respects, was fairly extreme. To have a law that said you have to use seniority for layoffs and nothing else.
Have to, so it can't even be,
right? And just all of the so-called due process rights that they put in place in California result in a very expensive and burdensome requirement for schools. All right. Now let's switch to the copycat suits in New York. There's 2 lawsuits in New York right now, though they may get combined together. One of them sponsored by the group run by Campbell Brown.
Yeah, Wright versus New York, I think is what that one's called.
So they are basically now going to make the same general arguments, right? Again, around LIFO, around the amount of time it takes before you can be eligible for tenure, and around the dismissals. I think they also have something in the New York case around sexual assault, teachers who get accused of sexual assault of children. All right. So what do you think? I mean, is there going to be likely the same outcome in New York?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me I read this morning the actual, what they put forward. And again, the argument is sort of the same, and it's like 4 points that they make. So the first is teacher effectiveness is necessary input to a sound basic education. And I feel like the evidence base that was laid out in the Vergara case, even just taken whole cloth, seems to pretty adequately make that case. Work of Tom Kane and Raj Chetty and all these guys. And then the other one is just sort of teacher tenure statutes confer permanent employment on ineffective teachers. And I think that they probably have the ability to demonstrate that ineffective teachers have received tenure. And it's disciplinary statutes keep ineffective tenured teachers in the school system. And again, I think that it's possible for them to demonstrate that, and to demonstrate that low-income or minority students are disproportionately impacted by that. And then the last one is that the LIFO statutes require the state to retain more senior teachers at the expense of more effective teachers. And I think that you could probably demonstrate that as well. So,
okay, so let's unpack this. So on LIFO, is it the same as California? It is a mandate. You must use seniority and nothing else in making these decisions?
I'm actually not entirely sure on that one. I know there's 10 states that have that. I'm actually not sure if New York is one of them.
Okay. We'll check that.
Somebody on Twitter,
or folks on Twitter, let us know. All right, and then this question about the probationary period. How long until you can get tenure? In New York, it's not 2 years, it's 3 years. Okay. And we'll talk about that. That may make a difference, right? That gives you a little more time, a little more data with which to make these decisions, right? And then there's the dismissal issues, which will probably play out largely similar. That people complain is still awfully hard. You can look at the data. Very few teachers have been dismissed throughout New York. It's still a very expensive proposition. All right, so that's what. Now, I think in New York, they don't have to prove the disparate impact piece necessarily. For some reason around the Constitution, they think they can just make this case that there is some sort of constitutional right to a good teacher. And if this stuff is getting in the way, the court may find that the state has to act. Okay. All right, next part I want us to talk about, let's talk about sort of the substance of this, okay? Let's talk about the pros and cons a bit on LIFO and on tenure and everything. Start with LIFO, all right? I suspect that neither of us I don't think even the Fern could make a strong argument that we should be making decisions based solely on seniority. I don't even think the unions I've never actually heard them make a strong case for this.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think they tend to make the sort of historical case that in the past, based on budgetary decisions and others, because more experienced teachers are are more expensive. In lean financial times, there would be an incentive to dismiss older, more experienced teachers for younger, more expensive teachers.
Right.
Now, this is troubling because in many states, the way dollars are apportioned to schools are based on full-time equivalents, and it doesn't matter if it's a 30-year teacher or a 2-year teacher, you get the money that's supposed to go to them. So I think that is, if they were making the case, that would be the case that they would make.
All right, that's fair. And then you could say back, look, well, we have age discrimination laws, right?
Exactly.
You're not allowed to discriminate based on the basis of age. But I think, look, even some on the reform side, like Kate Walsh at the National Council on Teacher Quality, she says, look, absolutely seniority should be one part of this, right?
Totally.
I mean, in most fields, and most, we do take, I mean, there is some about fairness and longevity and loyalty, and, so it should be one
school
factor.
Culture and all those things, and more effective teachers can help.
So it should be a factor. That's fine, but it shouldn't be the only factor, right? And so, and then there's the question of states mandating this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, should districts get to decide this? Should it be something that's bargained over in a local collective bargaining agreement? I mean, my own view is ideally what a state would say is, I would be comfortable with a state saying you must have seniority be one factor. It cannot be the only factor. Okay, so in other words, a local school district can't bargain away this right. They can't agree to a collective bargaining agreement where seniority becomes the only factor. Okay, sure. All right, but you could also say, but you do have to, it does have to be one factor in whatever policy you adopt, and the policy should also adopt other things like effectiveness.
Sure.
Right, okay. Do we agree on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I get, I push back a little bit whenever it's like you must use this as one factor. I would hope that local educators or local districts would have some discretion to say that if they could figure out a different way in which they didn't take those things into account. I get nervous with must.
Yeah, and I totally get that. I just worry, again, if you
could bargain it away.
That the bar, you're right, the unions are so strong that they'll get it. All right. Okay, so that's LIFO. All right, so, and I think, look, to be honest, we'll get into this a little bit later. I mean, I think this is where the reformers have the upper hand and the moral high ground, right? I mean, it's just so hard to defend seniority alone being the basis of these layoffs, right? Okay. Now we get into tenure. In my view, it starts to get a little bit trickier, okay? This question about how long until a teacher, you determine a teacher can get tenure. So in New York City, it's 3 years. That means that you have 2 years of achievement data and classroom observations, right? There's been some papers, including a great Hamilton project paper by Tom Kane and Doug Steeler, Robert Gordon, who's about to be the policy guy at the Department of Education, saying, hey, you can take 2 years of value-added data and you can predict with great precision which teachers are going to end up being quite effective in their career and which are not. And so you could use that data and screen out the bad teachers after 2 years and push them out of the classroom, and that would work just fine. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I mean, I think in one way, so it's using the sort of the system as it exists currently to make those kinds of projections. It could be different that teachers could react to tenure differently, for example. So like once you've cleared that 2-year hurdle, maybe you are a dynamite teacher for the next 7 or 8 years, but then after 10 or 12, it sort of tapers off or other things happen. So I would hate to, in any way, sort of try and tie the hands of people that are trying to make the right decisions to manage policy. So, just because they will be an effective teacher for 5 years or 7 years doesn't mean that over time they may taper off.
All right. So,
on a case-by-case basis, we're talking about sort of bell curves here, and there are people that are all over the place.
All right, so your position is going to be no tenure, period. I mean, you just don't believe that there should be tenure in our system.
So I think that we have to ask, what are we trying to accomplish with tenure?
Yeah.
And so I think there's the one argument of the sort of job protections of older teachers and such that has been widely taken care of in a lot of existing law that takes place. Now, the other piece that I think Jesse Rothstein and others have made relatively convincing arguments about is that teacher tenure could be a way to attract higher quality people to the teaching force, because if we can't necessarily help you on compensation or on benefits or something, having tenure could be a way to attract people. And I think that makes a lot of sense to try and attract people to it using tenure.
Because with the argument, that especially after the recession, all you millennials getting pummeled in the job market, the idea of saying, hey, you can come in and have a really good job, like a stable job, safe
defined
job,
benefit, pension, all these sorts of things.
That is attractive again.
That's an attractive thing to do. So if there's an argument for tenure, I think that's the most convincing one. But again, I go back to there are probably better ways to accomplish that than through policies that tie leaders' hands in the types of personnel decisions that they make. I would personally rather just, if we're trying to attract higher quality folks, I'd rather just pay them more. I'd rather make the benefits packages, more, bigger, better, allowing them to travel between jobs, because we know millennials tend to change jobs more as opposed to locking them in for their whole lives. So I think there are other ways to attract high quality people to the teaching force that don't have these other negative effects.
All right, but let me push back a little bit on this, okay? In New York City, Joel Klein, I think one of the best things that he did as chancellor there, he said, look, we are going to start taking the tenure decision much more seriously. Before, and almost everywhere in the country, it's just a rubber stamp, right? Somebody, whatever the probationary period is, the school districts almost always give almost everybody approval. Okay, you survive 3 years, you get tenure, right? And there's nothing more to it than that. Or there's some paperwork and it's total BS. And right, Joel Klein said, no, we're not going to do it that way. We are going to, and we have total authority to do this within our contract, within the state law in New York City. We're going to take this seriously, and we're going to really ask our principals to make a judgment. Is this person somebody that you think deserves tenure? And they started delaying tenure in many, many cases. High percentage of teachers that they said after 3 years, okay, we're not going to say no and say that you are now fired. Okay, that happened in a few cases, but we're going to say you haven't demonstrated yet that you deserve this high bar, and so we'll give you another year. All right, and the next year maybe they'd say we'll give you another year, but we're not going to give you tenure yet. And guess what? Many of those teachers left the system, and a study came out recently showing that dramatically raised the quality of teaching in New York City, raised student achievement, right? So to me, I'm saying, look, and this is what the unions say all the time, look, why don't you start by, if your problem is, getting rid of ineffective teachers, get rid of the ineffective teachers who are brand new. You have, total rights to do that right now. If you're not willing to do that, why are you obsessed about the 20-year veteran?
But it just seems to me we're creating like a Rube Goldberg device to do this.
Well, we already have we created that device decades ago.
I'm with you. So I'm saying, more, how do we strip away the Rube Goldberg device as opposed to adding like a few more levers and pulleys to make it work to our ultimate policy ends?
Yeah, all right. I can tell you're a Jay Green student when you use that term. He loves that, Rube Goldberg. All right, but you would say, but strategically,
like if you're gonna have tenure,
don't you think we would be all right? But don't you think we'd be in a much better place as reformers if we could demonstrate that? Okay, we have made sure that across the land we are taking that tenure approval decision very seriously. And I also think, look, for the most part, if you weed out the ineffective teachers after 2 or 3 or 4 years before they get tenure, that's going to take care of the vast majority of your troubles. I agree there could be some teacher that burns out down the road or something happens in their life and they all of a sudden are not a good teacher anymore. Okay, particularly maybe at the very end when they're hanging in there for their pension. I get that. That's real. Okay. But I think that the evidence would say that, the vast majority of ineffective teachers, people knew in those, they knew in the first month they were on the job probably. That you could be aggressive about this and actually fix most of the problem without having a big fight that we're having right now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about tactics and strategy.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the fact that this is playing out in courtrooms.
Yeah.
So, these are laws. We could have been trying to get the California legislature or the New York legislature to change these laws. Instead, reformers are now picking up the bludgeon of court cases, suing people, lawyering up.
Yeah.
Is this a smart development?
I am highly skeptical. I think the history of education litigation in America shows that when courts have gotten involved, whether it was in desegregation rulings, whether it was in school finance rulings, whether it's been in others, it has been a multi-decade process that has been extremely costly and onerous and difficult. So I think that it's, I think it's a troubling development if this is how it's going to be, if this is how it's going to go down.
Yeah. All right. And so the worry is what? That the courts are actually not very good at figuring out remedies.
Right? My colleague Rick Hass wrote about this, that, courts are very good at ensuring access to things. Yeah. So to ensure that you have the right to vote or you have the right to marry someone you love or those things. Like the courts can help you get that. But when it comes to actually getting you a quality something, so they can ensure that you have the right to vote. It won't necessarily say that you'll have a slate of good candidates to have. They'll ensure that you have the right to get married, but it won't necessarily ensure that you'll have a good one. So it's the same thing, so that it can ensure the fact that you have a school that you can go to and a place in that, but courts are just not in a great position to make that sort of quality, ensuring that every child has a quality education.
Should there be a right to having a good spouse, Mike? Just kidding. You're engaged right now, right? Yes, exactly.
She may be watching. I will not answer that.
All right. So, right. This is the worry is, let's say the court finds there is a constitutional right to a good teacher.
Yeah.
Right? All right, well, then the courts get involved in how you define a good teacher. Then you get involved in, well, we know there's a whole lot of complicated reasons we have struggled to get good teachers into every classroom. It has to do with salaries, which has to do with school finance, which gets you back down into that rabbit hole again, right? It has to do with working conditions. It has to do, I mean, it's a whole bundle of things, right? I mean, this is about how to manage organizations, how to, right? This is not about just saying, as you said, that you have a right to this or you don't have a right to that.
And it's even on a deeper level. So like, I don't actually fully understand what it means to say, so like, if you have the right to a quality teacher, does that mean you have a right to a quality teacher every year of your schooling?
Right.
Or in like a majority of the years in which you're there? So like, I don't actually even understand what
gym
that
class
means.
too, or is that
exactly? And so we're gonna have to try and develop some Byzantine way of figuring out whether you have an effective gym teacher or like.
Well, they're trying. Yeah, I mean, it's for the most part ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but let me push back. Paul Peterson and others have said no. Look, this is totally appropriate, and one reason it's appropriate. First of all, there's no way this was ever going to change in California without a lawsuit. The politics there were such that this was, the reason they had such extreme positions on this were because of the politics in California. Those weren't going to change. Number two, the court doesn't have to figure out how to solve all of this, right? It just can say back to the legislature, hey, you have to fix this. Right? And basically say, I'm going to hold you accountable for you doing something about this, rather than trying to get in a position where the courts now are micromanaging the schools. What's wrong with that?
I mean, I think that I don't want to call out Paul Peterson on history, but it seems to me the history of school finance cases, I mean, it got to the point where courts were dictating, I mean, they brought consultants in and said, the constitutional right to an education is one that costs X.
Right.
Like that's a penny less is unconstitutional. And I think the same thing happened in desegregation rulings. They set very strict definitions of this is what a desegregated school looks like. Or this is what it takes to declare, a school district unitary. So, I mean, I think that there's so much potential for that because what happens, what I would imagine is, so that's actually, and to be fair to the judge in the Vergara case, if you read it at the very end, he gives this like shout out to Alexander Hamilton and says like, it's not my job to legislate from the bench. These are unconstitutional laws and thus I have struck them down. Mm-hmm. And I think conservative, liberal, whatever, you say like, that's what courts are supposed to do. If they think of
elegant because it was the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution that kicked all of this stuff off in the first place.
But imagine they pass a new law and then it comes back. They say, nope, that one doesn't work either. Eventually, you would imagine they would seek some kind of guidance on this.
Right.
And then you just, it goes downhill from there.
All right. So, and I can imagine some people watching, say, Campbell Brown, who's pushing for this, might say, look, okay, these guys have admitted that LIFO is a problem. And I mean, you especially pushed hard on the tenure front. And I largely agree with you. But, and yet, and they also acknowledge that in a place like New York or California, the politics are such, so this is going to change. And so there's kids out there getting, screwed over every day, bad teachers, the system's broken, and, we're not willing to use one of these tools at our disposal because of because of our principles around the right role of the courts. I mean, is this a sense where we have to be more pragmatic, where we have to say, look, the reality is if we want this to change, this might be one way to get there?
Look, I mean, I think this is part of a sort of broader narrative that takes place in the education reform community of this sort of like righteousness of beliefs, wants to see an outcome by any means necessary. I think you and I would say it's the same thing about like No Child Left Behind waivers. Well, like, the legislature is not acting, so we're going to use a pen and a phone and make this thing happen. But then you have to ask yourself, like, if we set this kind of precedent, like, what happens in the future? So, like, you ask our friends on the political left, things like waivers, like, what if, it's President Paul, that gets elected? And I think it's the same thing in many of these cases, which is the very same arguments that they're making in these courts could be used to sink any number of programs that we think might be effective that can't demonstrate it. If it says, well, It doesn't give people access to adequate teachers or any of these types of things. So I think it's a slippery slope, and no one when they're on the slippery slope thinks that they're the one who's going to lose their footing. They think like, nope, we're
That's
cool.
good. Tweet that, people. Tweet that. That was good. I like that.
I'm a wordsmith, my friends.
I love it.
No, but that's the thing. Is it's like so again, I'm sympathetic to them, and I understand the urgency of what they're saying. Is that there are kids right now that have these problems that are stuck in classrooms with ineffective teachers, and we need to do something about it yesterday. Like, I get that, and I think that that's a noble and admirable sentiment.
Yep.
But you have to understand, in our system of government, the division of powers, federalism, all of these other things that exist.
You just lost the Fern. I'm sorry. That what you're talking. Yeah. You're going to bring up the 10th Amendment, aren't you?
Yeah. No. So in all of these systems that we have, like, different people when they're in power can do kind of what they want to do, and so it's important to remember that and not set precedents that could eventually be used to take down other things.
All right, last segment, and look, I want to get some folks in here. People are making great comments on Twitter. I'm not seeing any questions, but so if you have a question, come on in here. I mean, mostly they're just like, that McShane, he's freaking rocking it.
Oh,
all right, they're quoting you.
Great.
That's good sign. All right, so. Let's talk some more strategy. All right, so set aside the court thing. All right, I think we both agree that we've got real concerns about doing this through the courts. But just in general, picking a fight over tenure, picking a fight over LIFO right now. The unions have pushed back hard, saying these people are attacking teachers. I mean, they're all over Campbell Brown, saying that she's out to get teachers.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of teachers, really do feel between this stuff, the teacher evaluation stuff, that they feel like, the reformers are out to get them. That they're, and that it may be, according to some of these polls, it may be hurting morale. So. Is it worth it? Is this a good fight for us to be picking right now?
I mean, I don't know. I tend to think that the problem that we have, and we've been phrasing it as reformers, I think, in the wrong way, is that it's not that we have too many bad teachers. It's we don't have enough great teachers. It's not that we have too many bad schools. It's that we don't have enough great schools. So, like, you could fire every teacher that we think is ineffective tomorrow. Like, where does that leave us? Like,
but that's the whole point, right? Rick Hanushek, I mean, this is what's driving it. Rick Hanushek says you fire 5% of the teachers, the worst ones, and our student achievement will rise dramatically.
Now, what's the second piece of Rick Hanushek's research?
And you replace them with teachers that are average.
There you go. Right. So we have to not only club off the bottom part of the distribution, but then replace it somehow with people at the median of the distribution.
Did you just say that we should club teachers over the head?
Yeah, that'll get tweeted.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Right,
anyway, no, but so that's what I think the other problem is that so we have to talk about, so look, I get it. Like, I think if there are ineffective teachers out there, we should try and work to try and exit them from the profession or whatever the PC term is today. But really the conversation is like, how do we get more better teachers? How do we have more better schools?
Yep.
And ultimately these types of policies, I don't think are going to be able to answer that question. They may be able to do that first part of like, we have an immediate problem right now that we need to deal with, but how do we get more better teachers into classrooms?
And what about the politics of this, though, and the morale issues? I mean, is that real? Is that a red herring? I mean, do you think that the typical teacher out there is paying attention to Campbell, all this stuff, or is this? I mean, you and I, spend time on Twitter, so we get the skewed perspective of the world. I mean, are most teachers just out there doing their thing, living their lives, not paying attention to this national debate, or is this a problem that we're making teachers feel bad?
I think generally speaking that a lot of the complaints that teachers have about there being a war on teachers or telling them like are overblown, but every time one of these things comes up in the news, particularly around things like teachers or teachers unions and others, people say boneheaded things on television.
Yeah.
Right? And if you just happen to be watching the news that night, and people have said some straight ignorant things about teachers and about how, like, we got a bunch of lazy teachers out there, or like, you can be stupid and be a teacher, all that sort of stuff, which is like, if I'm sitting there watching that on television, like, I'd be really upset by that, just like I think any professional would be. So I think that part of it is, while you have these types of conversations, like keeping respect for the profession of teaching, for the education system, I think is important, and people lose sight of that to score cheap political points a lot.
Yeah. And look, and we've known for a long time that tenure, people get angry about tenure. I mean, it goes, I think there was, I remember some famous political book back in the late 90s saying that, I think it was back in the 96 campaign that, a Democratic strategist saying, well, they really would have been smart to go after teacher tenure. Yeah. They could have killed us on teacher tenure. I mean, this is one of these issues that's ripe for the picking, right?
Yeah, totally.
But it has this blowback. And look, and I will say, I mean, our last conversation was about Common Core. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Common Core and spend a huge amount of my time trying to defend it. I think it's a problem right now that we have teachers who are feeling under attack, that we are in a moment, just as the standards are being implemented and these new tougher tests are coming, when I think we'd be in a better place if the atmosphere was about support, about we're trying to help the field get better, we're trying to do this hard thing, which is to improve teaching and learning, we're trying to aim for these higher expectations. I mean, all very much about a positive message around support. That in effect, my own view is that the accountability stuff, particularly the school accountability, but the teacher stuff too, that I think has not been well designed, has played itself out. And so we're trying to figure out what the next phase of reform is going to be. Okay, I mean, there's school choice over here, still growing, still doing its thing. Okay, but within the major part of the system, and I think this moment should be about saying, we are moving to these higher standards. We need to support teachers in the field as we get there. And this is not a time to be going, making them feel like we're attacking them. And then down the road, it'll be time again to talk about what's the right accountability for the adults in the system. Okay, but it's very hard to do that when we've got, we keep sparking these fights out there. And so again, with due respect to Campbell Brown, I just don't know that she's helping us with the rest of the reform agenda, where frankly, we need the teachers right now. We need them politically and we need them educationally. Like this stuff around Common Core in particular, it is only going to work if the teachers in the classroom are putting their heart and soul into it, and it's only going to survive politically if the teachers remain supportive of it.
No, well, I think that's the problem, though. Every education reform relies on teachers.
Yeah.
Right. So anything you want to do, if you want to change a curriculum, if you want to change the way schools are operated, you have to have teachers on board.
Except for school choice, perhaps.
No, but school choice, those schools are still staffed full of teachers.
Right.
So they have to buy into what the school of choice is doing, and so reform can't seem like it's something that's done to teachers. It's got to be something that's done with them. But that also requires actually listening to them and taking them into account.
Right.
Which I'm assuming many of them are probably tweeting stuff at us right now. So
all right, let's see.
I'm going to check in full of my own medicine.
Well, Alexander Rousseau believes you are spouting conventional wisdom about courts not being good for school quality issues and asking if that's really true. That's interesting. Is that the conventional wisdom now? I guess only after failing, the court's failing for 50 years.
Experience have shown that as such.
Daniela Fairchild wants to know, how much are judicial advocacy efforts actually about changing things in the courts versus raising awareness? Now that's a good point.
That's a good point.
I think that's a fair point.
mean,
look, Vergara got a ton of press.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And now the New York one is getting a ton of press as well. We wouldn't have these conversations maybe if they were just legislative efforts.
I'm with you. The only thing is I feel like some of the coverage in the story out of the New York case is a little bit different. So the Vergara case was, when we saw the coverage of it, it was about, the headlines leading in was sort of all about tenure and LIFO and about the policies. If you look at the headlines and all the coverage about the ones in New York, it's all about Campbell Brown.
Yeah.
And it's Campbell Brown versus Randy Weingarten or versus Diane Ravitch or versus whoever versus the army of Twitter trolls that are horrible and said ridiculously terrible things to them. And so I think there is a sort of difference in kind in how these particular cases, the sort of PR campaign around the cases are. Is it about the kids, about the policy, or are these giant? And look, I think it's very possible that in a place like New York, which is such a sort of personality-driven political media marketplace, it's going to be people versus people.
Well,
But I do think that it's tough when so much of the story we're talking about now is people saying terrible things about Campbell Brown.
Yeah.
It's like, well, no, the policies, this is about these policies that need to change.
And poor Campbell, they keep, they want to paint her as a right-wing elitist. And I have heard from many right-wing elitists that are just upset. They're like, hey, we're the right-wing elitists.
Come on, guys. Come on,
give me
guys.
things.
Exactly.
Why did she get all the attention?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, got a question from Daniela Fairchild. A little far field, Daniela, but we'll go for it anyways. It is about how, I just lost it. There it is.
So many questions are coming in.
So many, I can't.
Keep up with them.
It was basically, if teachers are not born but they are made, what can we do to help make more good teachers? This, of course, relates to the new book out by Elizabeth Green, Building a Better Teacher. So, I mean, what do you think? You say I mean, you said earlier, and people did love this, that we need, it's not that we need less bad teachers, we need more good teachers. How are we going to get more good teachers?
So, I mean, if you think about it, it's on a couple different levels. So one is about teacher preparation.
Yep.
So within our traditional schools of education, but also within alternative training pathways and others,
Yep.
like actually trying to focus more on what we know about good teaching or more clinical experience and others, I think is a good place to start with that. But I think also the sort of angle on this that the folks, stuff that I read all the time and love and want more people to know about is like public impacts work.
Yep.
They talk about another thing to do is try and extend the reach of effective teachers, reorganize the way that we have schools to allow high quality teachers to reach more students, either using technology or team teaching or different approaches from that. So I think there's a lot of different ways. I mean, we tend to think of the traditional paths of more and better professional development, which I think in many ways can be kind of a dead end. We tend to talk about changing colleges of education, which I think there are some promising examples of people doing innovative things, but also it's about how do we change schools to make teachers' lives easier and to help them do their jobs better.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, I mean, this question about board not made, I mean, I definitely think you can help people become much better teachers, and it's been exciting to see programs like Relay, to see what's happening in some of the great ed schools that NCTQ highlights in their report, and the work of Doug Lemov to go around the country and try to say, look, here's some very concrete practices that great teachers tend to use, and that if you use them in your classroom, you'll be more effective. But it may be that all of those efforts, they kind of top out at some level. I mean, there's some combination of talent that's not just about teaching, but more broadly about being, whatever it is, charismatic, being a leader, being good with people, knowing your subject. Then there's all the sort of what we do know about good teaching, and we know something. We've learned more lately. Combine that together, and you can get so far. But you're going to have some people who are just going to top out. And no matter how many professional development seminars they go to, they're probably not going to get much better.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to a question of sort of then, at what level do we want to make decisions about those folks?
Yeah.
About their continued employment, about what they need to do. And I think that the more we choose to sort of centralize that type of stuff, like you and I don't know what good teaching is. Right? That's not my specialty. I was a teacher, but I'm a policy guy, right? I think you're a policy guy. You have a similar background to me.
Yep.
There are people that are actually in school buildings, operating schools, that know within their context what good teaching looks like.
Yep.
And so as much as we can empower them to make these decisions, but the more we sort of treat teachers like widgets, or the more we standardize and make these types of systems that are rigid and don't necessarily allow for that type of differentiation, I think that that's problematic too.
So where does this go, McShane? I mean, so we're going to see this continue to play out in New York City. There may be other copycat suits elsewhere. Do you think a year from now we're going to still be talking about these issues and these court cases, or is this going to kind of blow over?
It sounds like Lawrence Tribe this morning was just signed on by these folks to try and take these court cases elsewhere. I think if they want to do this in more states, kind of like with the map that y'all highlighted, there appear to be some places where there is low-hanging fruit that have either very short tenure periods or LIFO policies that are uniformly set where you have to use seniority. And it would seem to me that if a couple dominoes fall in places, that these types of lawsuits could take those out in other places. Now, again, one might hope that this would, if legislatures see the writing on the wall, or even organizations like teachers unions and others see the writing on the wall and say, like, hey, look, this is going to go away. We need to develop a system that will stand up to muster. It might actually motivate them to try and create better systems.
And then I will say, I really do hope that we reformers figure out a way to help schools take the tenure approval decision much more seriously. In Ohio, for example, where we work on the ground, amazingly, there is a 7-year probationary period. I mean, that's huge, right? So in Ohio, they have a ton of good information about whether these teachers are effective or not. So that's plenty of time to make a good decision. What I don't know is whether any superintendents are actually, saying, hey, now that we have this information, let's make sure we don't just rubber stamp people anymore. Now, what we're not so good at, I think, in the reform community is knowing how do we get out to those superintendents? How do we get to those HR directors? How do we get to those people in the field? And just say to them, hey, here's how Joel Klein did it. Here's the impact it made in terms of teacher quality. You can do this. It doesn't take a fight with your union. It doesn't take a change in state law. You can do it right now, and it can make a big difference for kids. That's, again, talking about low-hanging fruit, that is some low-hanging fruit that I think can make a big difference right away.
Yeah, helping build capacity within those individuals and within those systems to make better decisions. Sure.
All right, well, we will end it at that. On behalf of Mike McShane at the American Enterprise Institute, our Fern, and Mike Petrilli at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. This has been a Fern Between Two Mics. This will be available on our website immediately for replay, again and again and again, at edexcellence.net. We will do another one of these soon.
Let's do it.
Stay tuned, and thank you for joining in.